I have to marry my cowboy friend's widow or lose the ranch to thieves. In the merciless sun of Red Creek, Colorado, circa 1875, the air hung heavy and still, thick with the shimmering heat that clung to the baked earth. A gust of wind, a rare event, only served to whip up a stinging cloud of dust, making the world a canvas of oppressive red and brown. This was a land that bred solitude and demanded a certain kind of toughness, a truth etched into the landscape and mirrored in the face of a lone man. Elias, a figure of silent endurance, stood at the edge of his property. His worn-out boots were caked in the same clay that covered the cracked expanse of the ranch, his faded jeans and patched denim jacket, a uniform of a life lived by the land's unyielding rules. A man of few words, his conversations were with the cattle, the rusted machinery, and the fence posts he hammered into the ground with relentless precision. He was a man defined not by the people he knew, but by the work he did alone. Just as the sun began its descent, bleeding a weak orange across the sky, Elias, seated on his dusty porch, carefully sharpened a hunting knife, his movements methodical and practiced. He was just a ghost, an echo in the quiet canyon. Suddenly, a sound tore through the silence, a cry, faint and distant, but unmistakable. It was a child's cry, thin with desperation, a sound utterly alien to this harsh, barren land. The cry came from the north, from the treacherous, winding path that cut through the canyons. The noise shattered the peace and the loneliness that Elias had long cultivated, a sharp intrusion into his predictable world. He froze, his calloused hand tightening on the knife hilt. The calm he lived by, the isolation he had built, now felt fragile. He had a choice to make, a clear line drawn in the dust before him. Ignore the sound and maintain his solitary peace, or respond to a call that promised only trouble and entanglement. Without a moment of hesitation, he rose to his feet, a heavy responsibility settling on his shoulders. He walked with a determined stride toward the canyon, his feet kicking up dust with every step. The child's cry, though weak, was an iron hook pulling him forward, forcing him to confront a world he had so carefully avoided. He was no hero, no rescuer, but something in the desperate sound would not let him stay where he was. He was moving, and with every step, the story of his solitary life was beginning to turn on a new page. He had to go. The funeral took place on a hot afternoon, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the dirt road leading up to the small cemetery. A few cottonwoods stood along the fence line, their branches hardly moving, offering little shade for the townsfolk gathered there. Men kept their hats in hand, women dabbed at their faces with cloth, and the preacher spoke over the pine box laid across wooden beams. His voice was steady, practiced, and short. Kateri stood nearest the coffin, her dress black but already dusted at the hem from the walk. Her posture was rigid, her jaw tight, her knuckles pale around the small handkerchief she held. She had not cried in front of the town. Her tears had already come in the long night before. Now she stayed upright out of sheer determination, though her shoulders looked like they could give at any moment. She stared at the coffin, as if staring hard enough might keep it from being lowered into the ground. Jericho Elias Jericho, though most folks used the back half of his name, stood 3 steps behind and to the side. He kept his hat pressed to his chest, his eyes on the coffin, not because he wanted to, but because looking at Kateri's grief felt harder than looking at death itself. He carried guilt like a yoke across his shoulders. Guilt that a good man, her good man, was the one buried today instead of him. Guilt that John Carver had given him a chance years ago, when no one else would. The preacher's words washed past him like heat mirage. He heard instead the old echo of John's laugh, the ring of a hammer on a shoeing stand, the easy way the man said, "Stay as long as you need." When the first shovel of earth struck the pine lid, Kateri flinched. Jericho's fingers tightened against his hat brim, an impulse to step forward rising and falling in the same breath. The right words didn't exist. I watched them lower the coffin, a long pine box too small for the size of John's heart. Arizona's red earth swallowed him with an indifference that felt almost obscene. Heat pressed down. A cow lowed from beyond the far fence. A grasshopper hurled itself at a boot and fell still. The world continued, as if the loss of a man who could mend a broken axle with baling wire and prayer counted for nothing. John should have had the mourning of his people songs in the old tongue, cedar smoke, the circle of kin, but Kateri's people kept to the hills and the canyons and the edges of this town's tolerance. They would not show themselves here. And the world that made Jericho a world of bunkhouse rules and quick draws and debts a man pays with his back didn't have much use for ceremony. This tidy grief, sunstruck and polite, had no place for him either. The crowd thinned the way summer shadows do short, then gone. A few men drifted toward the livery, talking in low voices that made gossip sound like charity. The preacher tapped his hat and left with the undertaker. Kateri stood as if rooted to the spot, and only when the shovels were leaned back against the fence and the last of the dirt tamped did Jericho feel the elders' eyes settle on him. They gathered in the shade like drought, 4 men who had seen too many springs to waste words. When they called his name, he knew what they would say before he reached them. "Elias," said the one with the gray whiskers, a rancher whose cattle had outlived 2 droughts and a foreclosure. "Truth is truth. She can't hold it alone." Jericho's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue on principle, but he'd seen the arithmetic of widowhood done in other counties. A brand questioned here, a water claim challenged there, a cousin appearing with a paper and a witness who couldn't look a judge in the eye, land broken apart into debts, a house emptied 1 plate at a time. The elder did not soften it. John's kin would move fast, creditors faster, and the law wore a face friendlier to ledgers than to love. Unless Kateri remarried, the ranch would be unstitched, without a thread out of place. Anger came first, hot as forge heat anger at a world where a woman's grip on what she built could be pried loose by signatures. Fear followed, cold and practical. Jericho was a man of wire and post holes, not hearth and home. He'd slept under stars that didn't know his name, and woken beneath roofs that didn't remember he'd been there. How could he be what Kateri needed? But duty arrived last, and sat down heavy. John had pulled him from beneath a fallen horse, patched him with whiskey and rough thread, and set a plate at the bunkhouse table as if they'd been brothers from birth. "Stay as long as you need." Jericho stayed. Years, not weeks. "You were closest to him, Elias," the elder pressed. "No other man will stand between her and what's coming." Jericho lowered his eyes to the red dust chewing at his boots and listened to his pulse knock behind his ear. The answer formed the way storms form over mesas, gradual, then sudden and inarguable. It wasn't desire. It wasn't even hope. It was loyalty. "I'll talk to her," he said. John's house sat plain and square at the yard's edge. Boards planed smooth by a man who believed in use more than show, windows clean out of habit, not pride. Inside, the air held the faint tin bitter note of old coffee and the ash memory of last winter's fires. Kateri occupied a straight-backed chair like a sentinel occupying a wall. Her bonnet lay on the table, a pale ring on her forehead where the band had pressed. Her hands were folded to hide their tremble. She had buried a husband in heat, a woman shouldn't have to endure, and now faced the arithmetic that arrived after funerals, uninvited and punctual. Jericho took the threshold as a man might take a river crossing steady, eyes on the far bank. He felt too large for the parlor, all angles and boot scuffs, a tool that didn't belong on a kitchen shelf. He had practiced words on the ride from town, rehearsed them against saddle leather and the dry wind's indifference. In the room, they weighed more than iron. "You know why I've come," he said at last, keeping his voice low, as if sound itself could bruise. Kateri looked at him in a way that measured not only the man, but the intention behind him. He spoke as a ranch hand speaks to a broken gate, direct, unadorned. "They'll take it by paper. A name on a line keeps it where it is. I won't be passed from one man to another because the town wants the place tidy," she answered. The steel in her voice didn't clang. It hummed, quiet and undeniable. "John is not cold in the ground." She set those words on the table the way you set down a knife, safe, if respected, dangerous otherwise. "I know," Jericho said. "I won't force anything. I'll work. As long as you'll have me. That much I owe." It would have been easier if he'd asked for something for himself, easier to refuse a man's want than his promise. Kateri watched him, seeing what John had spoken of. A silence built of usefulness, a steadiness that didn't ask to be thanked. Pride rose in her like heat, pride that wouldn't be bartered, pride that belonged to her mother's mother and the women before that. But beneath it lay the unjust map of this place, a widow's path narrowed by law and the appetites of men who called themselves family. Papers don't wait, he added, awkward with the truth, hat still in his hand as though he'd forgotten he could put it down. The window carried late sun in a narrow stripe across the floorboards. Outside, the corral's top rail cut a hard horizon. Kateri felt time tally itself in breaths. Grief wanted to sit. The world required standing. "I will decide," she said. Jericho inclined his head. It wasn't consent, it was room. He stepped back into the doorway. "I'll be at the north line before dark." Days do not honor mourning on a working spread. The pump coughed like an old man at first light. Hinges objected. A heifer's calf didn't understand that death had occurred and demanded her due. Work, like weather, is indifferent and therefore faithful. Jericho rose with the light and worked the ranch the way John had taught him. Fence first, then water, then herd, then whatever the day breaks on you. He replaced 2 rotten posts with mesquite that would outlast them both, patched a gate with a bootstrap and a cussed blessing, pulled a loose shoe and rasped it true. Kateri kept the book in the house, but housework on a ranch is not a soft labor. She mended the feed sacks so the corners wouldn't leak oats like a trail of apology, boiled coffee so strong it could wake a dead man who wanted to be woken, and stitched a tear in the only good curtain because dignity does not wait on surplus. She watched him sometimes from the window with the ledger open in front of her, seeing John's hand in the neat columns and Jericho's hand in the yard. The unspoken built its own small bridge between them. At sundown, she put a tin cup on the porch rail. He emptied it every time, even if the coffee had gone cold and bitter. He always put the cup back where he'd found it. It was a kind of vow. He did not set his hat on John's peg by the door. He left it on the porch post, a courtesy the house seemed to appreciate. Town divided along its usual invisible lines. Those who believed a widow's grief should be quiet and brief. Those who believed a man's work could be counted like coins and claimed, those who believed both, and those who practiced believing neither. In the store, 2 women performed their opinion like church hymns. Improper, one whispered. Expected, the other replied. At the smithy, hammers didn't stop so much as slow when Jericho led a limping mare through. Eyes lingered a heartbeat too long. No one said the words out loud, but the air carried them anyway. He absorbed it the way a man absorbs raincoat on, collar high, keep moving. At night, Kateri read the book John kept, as if the numbers themselves might sing him back a fool's hope she indulged, because it kept the fear from eating the edges of her. Payments recorded and crossed tidy, salt block tallies, head counts in a steady hand. Beside some entries, John had left a brief word to himself, as if to a partner. Later, better, ask Elias. Her fingertip paused over his name written there, and she felt something catch in her chest, a stitch in a seam you'd thought would never hold again. Jericho lay on the spare bed and tried not to listen to the house or the memory that the bed had once held his fever through a winter that might have killed him, but didn't, because John had made it his business that it wouldn't. He thought about the cousins who had circled like winter crows at other funerals he'd known, about the clerk whose pen had more power than a 6-gun if you stood on the wrong side of it, about the elders who were right, and the pride that was right, and how sometimes truths fight one another like stud colts in a too small pen. On the 3rd day, Jericho came in at noon to water, and a shade of cool, and found Kateri at the table with John's ledger open, and a letter folded tight beside it, the fold creased sharp as a boot ridge. She didn't look up. "They'll file at the county seat," she said. "A date, within the month." His mouth thinned to a line. "They'll try to pull it apart in pieces so we can't feel it until the house is air." She let out a breath that had been sitting high in her chest since the funeral. "I won't let them count my dishes before I've washed them." "You won't be alone at that table," he said. And this time he put his hat on the chair rung. And Saturday, he set the callus of his thumb on the page where John had written a number clean and true. "We'll answer with what's written." She studied him as if he were a tool she hadn't yet learned the use of. a man of few sentences who put each where it would do work. It was not comfort, it was steadiness, which is the chassis under comfort, the thing that holds when comfort breaks. Afternoons lengthened, and their work found a rhythm that belonged to neither of them and both. He fixed the latch on the chicken coop. She arrived with a handful of nails, without being asked. She weeded the garden. He stepped into the rows with a spade because the ground had not learned it ought to be soft. When she carried a sloshing bucket, he took the weight without taking the handle from her, a small grammar of respect. At the general store, they became the kind of pair the town marked with side glances and tight mouths, two people who walked out together, one paying for nails, the other for coffee, ledger paper shared between. It was not romance the town smelled, it was defiance. Neither of them corrected the town. On Sunday, she wore black because grief does not keep the Sabbath, and he wore the white shirt whose sleeves remembered the shape of his arms on the few days a year he allowed it. They sat on the back bench, where those who come late or are uncertain of their welcome tend to sit. After, John's older cousin met them with a man who introduced himself as an agent for distant kin and spoke in the tight, courteous way men do when they intend harm. He questioned debts and signatures, frowned at the marriage like it had soured the milk in his breakfast. Kateri didn't step back. "Proper," she said, "is the work done and the debts paid. If you know different, bring your proof to the justice and not to my dress." Jericho didn't put a word on top of hers. He stood at her shoulder and made space with the suggestion of his body. The cousin's eyes flicked to the shape of that suggestion and decided to take his outrage to paper instead of to fists. That was fine. Paper had a way of showing its own hands. That evening, Kateri set 2 cups on the table and pushed one toward him. "For standing," she said. He shook his head once. "I'll stand whether or not you say it." She didn't thank him again. He didn't require it. The silence that followed carried something new, not resignation, but the first faint line of trust drawn with a carpenter's pencil across fresh wood. Thin, but true. Days stacked themselves. He mended the north line. She balanced the ledger to a certainty that would hold in any courtroom that still remembered what justice was for. The town talked as towns do, and the talk had edges. They worked on. One night, a wind came up out of nowhere and rattled the loose tin on the tack shed roof until the nails complained. Jericho rose in his stocking feet and went out with a hammer and a lantern. He didn't ask Kateri to hold the light, but she appeared with her shawl around her shoulders and stood with the flame lifted while he drove the nails back into sense. She didn't speak. He didn't either. When the wind fell, he nodded, and she lowered the lamp, and together they walked back to the door of the house that had held a man they both loved, and the future neither of them had asked for but had taken up anyway. By the 3rd week, the pattern had set: work, ledger, coffee, silence that wasn't hostile, glances that weren't evasive. Kateri realized she had not once asked him why he stayed. It sank into her then that perhaps John had known this would be the long echo of his life, that in saving a man once, he had given her the safeguard she would need when he could no longer step between her and the world. The thought hurt and comforted at the same time. Truth often does. When the first letter arrived gray morning, dust still sleeping on the yard, Kateri read it at the table with her back straight and her breath shallow. She folded it once, clean. Then she found Jericho at the corral, brushing down John's favored bay. She did not speak until she could trust the shape of her words. "They've set a date," she said, "and they mean to make paper into a pry bar." He laid the brush down, turned, and let his eyes meet hers, without sliding off to the easy ground of politeness. "Then we'll brace what they try to lever," he said. "All of it." Lo. She hadn't married him for the way his words sat in a room, but that sentence built a brace in her like a crossbeam. Thin, at first. Enough to hold. That night she took John's coat from the peg and pressed her brow to the worn collar, and stood that way until the ache in her throat became something she could swallow. She hung it back up. Not yet, but soon. Work went on. The windmill rattled. He sharpened the rod. The pump remembered its job. A fence staple shot wide. She held it steady, and he set it straight. Coffee cooled on the rail and was drunk anyway. The town nattered. The horizon suggested rain, and then didn't deliver. Life, as it insists on doing, continued in the face of death. And while it did, the thing between Kateri and Elias Jericho shifted from accident into choice. Not chosen in a church or by the county clerk's hand alone, but chosen in 100 plain acts a court will never record and a town won't entirely understand. She chose to pour the second cup. He chose to drink it all. She chose to open the ledger and ask, "What would you do here?" He chose to answer. And when she disagreed, he chose not to be offended. These are the small hinges on which large doors swing. In a country where paper can strip a woman of what she's built, there are other papers that can be gathered like stones for a wall. Receipts, brand renewals, notes paid, names signed in ink, and witnessed by the common sense of men who tend to their own. Kateri and Jericho began to gather these, quietly, and with the care of people building a defense that would be measured by the weight of its truth. The day's end found them shoulder to shoulder at the table, the ledger open like a map between them, grief seated in the corner, patient and less hungry than before. The moon rode up over the ridge that night like a silver coin tossed onto a counter to settle a long account. In its light, the ranch looked almost gentle. The posts stood where posts should stand. The house held its shape. The windmill turned, unbothered by what men resolved to do or deny in town. Kateri stood on the porch, arms folded, and watched the yard that had taken her youth and given her a life in return. Jericho crossed from the barn with his hat in his hand, an outline cut from the same wood as the place itself. He paused at the steps, not climbing until she nodded. He stood there a long moment, not speaking, as if to show her what she already knew and needed to see from him anyway, that some men leave and some men stay. And he was, without announcement or flourish, the second kind. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. And that was how the first chapter of the fight began. Not with gun smoke or legal thunder, but with two people who had not chosen one another, learning to hold ground together against the wind. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. The first letter did not arrive with thunder or riders or a dust storm that could be blamed later. It came on bootsteps, soft as apology, carried by a freckled boy who kept glancing over his shoulder like the envelope might bite him. Morning hadn't burned the chill off yet. The corral boards were still dew-damp, and a line of swallows stitched a fast seam under the eaves. Kateri signed her name in a hand that was steadier than her lungs, thanked the boy, and watched him trot back down the lane like a colt eager for a gate. She didn't open the letter on the porch. She took it inside, set the kettle on, and stood a while with both palms pressed to the scarred table as if bracing against a wave. When she broke the seal, the words did not leap. They lay there, neat and careful, as if tidiness could soften a blow. A date. A warning polished into courtesy. The phrasing of men who never lifted a post-hole digger in their lives, but knew how to shift land with ink. She breathed out once, slow and even, and folded the paper tight again until it was no more than a pale stick in her fist. Then she went to find Elias Jericho. He was with John's Bay, working a stiff brush through the coat like he had a quarrel with sweat itself. He did not turn at her steps. He knew them. She waited a handful of strokes before she spoke, letting the rasp of bristles against hide fill what would have been just silence. "They've said it," she said. He stopped brushing. For a beat his hand hung in the air, then set the brush on the rail like it mattered to put things down where they belonged. He didn't ask what "it" was. Men who work dirt for a living learn to hear the weight tucked inside a word. "They'll file at the county seat," she added. "Within the month." He nodded once, the way a man nods to weather he can't talk out of a mood. "Then we plan for the month to be shorter than it looks." Kateri didn't sit at the fence. She never leaned when there was standing to be done. "They'll say, 'I can't hold it,' that a woman's hand shakes when it signs, that the herd'll scatter if it smells grief on me." His mouth did not move, but something in his stare set like poured lead. "They can say it. Paper can say a man owns the sky. That don't put a harness on clouds." "I am not arguing weather with them," she said, and the iron in her voice was quiet, not clang. "I am arguing what's ours." He finally met her eyes. "Then we collect what proves it is." That afternoon he climbed to the loft over the barn and came down with the old trunk John had built in a spring when fence posts outnumbered coins. Inside were receipts folded until the creases had become habits, 2 brand renewals, 3 notes with "paid" scrawled across them by a clerk who never learned to spell neat. Kateri brought the ledger from the house, the one with margins that knew John's pencil like a friend. They spread this paper life across the table as carefully as a doctor lays out instruments, and for the next hours, the house filled with the slow rustle of dates and numbers that refused to lie. Near sundown, Jericho found a slip he didn't expect. A letter from years back. John's hand plain as a fence rail, turning away a cousin who came begging for a loan that's really a slice. Kateri's breath hitched just once. Grief catches at honesty and won't let go. She set that letter in a stack she hadn't named yet, one that lived somewhere between proof and benediction. The house changed as the piles grew. Not warmer, not softer, truer. A kind of steadiness built there that even the wind could respect. When the kettle forgot itself and screamed, Kateri poured 2 cups, black enough to scold, and pushed one toward Elias. He drank it all, though it had gone mean withstanding. He set the cup exactly where he'd found it. They both noticed. Neither said so. Town had already begun its small cruelties. A woman in calico bladed her words at the dry goods counter and watched more than she bought. 2 hands from a spread down river let their talk slow when Elias stepped into the smithy for nails, then sped it up again when he left. The preacher shook Jericho's hand with the deliberate weight of a man proving he was not a coward. The justice's clerk, thin, careful fellow with cuffs always a little too clean, looked at their papers and nodded the way men nod at a storm 2 valleys over. Respectful, not yet afraid. That night, wind shouldered the tack shed till the loose tin clattered like a bad dream. Jericho went out in his socks with a hammer and a lantern. Kateri followed with a shawl and held the light without being asked. Neither spoke. Sparks from the nail heads winked away into dark. When the last sheet lay down and minded, he touched the brim of his hat. He'd forgotten he wasn't wearing it, and she lowered the lamp. And they walked back to the doorway of a house that had known a different man's footsteps and was learning these. Days settled into a rhythm that wasn't quite theirs and wasn't not. Mornings began with pump water that ran iron dark for a few pulls and then sweet. Elias checked the north line, where posts lean in spring like old men considering a nap. Kateri mended a feed sack with small exact stitches and boiled coffee fierce enough to wake sins. He didn't set his hat on John's peg. He left it on the porch post. She didn't move John's coat. She did straighten it once without meaning to and stood there a long beat after, her hand at the collar as if listening for something that might answer back. On the 4th day, a rider they did not know found a reason to pass the yard slow. He took off his hat at Kateri with a politeness that smirked and looked too long at the corral. Elias stepped into the doorway and wiped his palms on a rag he hadn't needed to use. The rider's glance flicked from one to the other and away, like a hand that touched heat. He tipped his hat again and went on. They watched the dust he left, because there are some things you ought to watch leave. That afternoon brought a different kind of test. A rattler found the cool stone lip of the well and lay there in a loop of mean rope, watching everything with that dead gold patience only snakes and the very pious have. Water was want. Fear was also. Elias fetched the long-handled hoe and the kind of calm he didn't always have when the trouble had hands. He didn't swing rattler heads don't reward haste. He lifted, coaxed, set the snake down in the brush at a distance beyond sin, then stood with both hands on the hoe like a farmer in a painting, and waited until the tail wrote its last word. Kateri exhaled. "Thank you," she said, and neither of them pretended the words were only for the snake. The elders came in the dusklight of a day that had been longer than it should. They stood under the cottonwood where gossip had smoothed the earth bare. The one with gray whiskers did the talking. "Daughter," he said, using a word he held as if it might break if carried wrong. "You know what will be said. You know what will be done." He left a space for pride. Pride stepped in and set down a chair. "I know what's mine," Kateri answered. "And what was John's? And what is this land's which is not mine or John's, but lends itself to those who don't lie to it?" He grunted, satisfied and not. His eyes cut to Elias. "You stand?" Jericho nodded once. "I do." "Then you stand quiet. Paper talks better than fists in some rooms." Elias did not smile. "I can keep both in my pockets." The old man almost smiled back. "I recall." They left with nods that weren't blessings but were nearer to them than curses. In their wake, the yard felt momentarily like a church, when the hymn ends and nobody is quite ready to sit. Kateri slept little that night. When she did, the dreams came crowded, John's laugh ringing off the anvil, a hand not his on the door latch. The taste of well water turned strange with dust. She got up between times and stood in the parlor, palms flat on the ledger like prayer. She was not a woman given to bargaining with heaven. She was a woman who washed what was dirty, mended what was torn, fed what was hungry, and buried what was beyond her saving. But she asked, just once, as the lamp soot spiraled into the chimney glass, "Let me keep what we've paid for twice, once in coin, once in days." If prayer traveled, it went out by way of a coyote's thin cry and came back as a dawn that did not argue. The wedding, when it came, was the small kind done for sense rather than celebration. Jericho wore the white shirt that had memories in the cuffs from a spring cattle drive that went right because a river didn't. Kateri wore gray with a clean collar and a jaw that made men think twice before they used a soft voice on her. The preacher said the words as if he'd learned the taste of them on other mouths, in calmer rooms. 2 witnesses from the feed store signed their names with pens that made them feel important for an hour, and then hungry again by noon. Outside, the sky put on a brave show blue, clean, nothing in it, and the town watched without moving their lips much. Kateri did not take Elias's arm walking out. He did not offer it. They went side by side at a pace that said they knew the ground and would not trip on it for the sake of strangers' eyes. In the wagon, between them, the seat felt narrower than it had that morning and also somehow easier to sit. She put her hand on the board between them, not to touch him, not to make a point, just to lay something down where both could see it. He kept his eyes on the team and his ears on the street, counting the silences, which are sometimes more telling than words. At home, nothing moved. That was the first kindness. The house did not try to pretend it had changed. John's coat hung in its place like a river stone that had learned better than to fight the current. The bed in the spare room held its shape. The kitchen air was coffee and flour and the faint, tinny ghost of last night's beans. Kateri put the folded marriage paper in the desk with a care that made the drawer glide better than it had in months. Elias went to the yard and put his hand on the bay's neck and let the horse breathe him. There are witnesses that sign with steadier ink than feed clerk. In the week after, the work did not alter to accommodate new nouns. The hens did not lay richer for respectability. The pump did not pour sweeter because a clerk had written a name twice on a page. Jericho tightened wire like each staple was a yes. He took a rasp to a shoe with the slow, exact strokes of a man who understands that iron, like a mule, will listen if you speak low and insist. Kateri measured flour and sorrow in equal cups, both heaping, and made bread that rose anyway. Each night she set 2 cups on the table. Each night he drank to the bottom. They did not name what this was. Not love. Not yet. But not nothing, either. On Sunday they went to church and took the back bench. The bell sounded like it was trying to remember what joy felt like. The cousin John's blood, thinned by years of small meanness, brought a man who called himself an agent and wore the sort of hat that spends more time in mirrors than in weather. He spoke with the careful cruelty of a man who knows how to call a woman ma'am while taking the food off her table. He questioned debts he hadn't paid. He frowned at a marriage that kept him from combing through someone else's drawers. Kateri did not lower her eyes. "If your paper knows something my ledger doesn't, bring it to the justice," she said. "Not to my dress." The cousin's smile turned narrow. Elias did not step forward. He merely stood where a fist would have had to ask permission. That was enough. The men took their grievances where such things are fed away to talk of affidavits and witnesses who could be purchased with favors and forgetfulness. That night, when the house settled and the wind milled in the cottonwoods with its old wheat sack sound, Kateri came to the door of the spare room. Jericho was setting his boots side by side with an exactness he applied to everything that might trip a man in the dark. She did not step in. "You can move your things," she said. The words surprised them both with the way they did not wobble. He straightened, did not reach for anything. "I won't stand ahead of you." "You aren't," she answered. "You're exactly where you've been standing." She left him there with the clean space of choice. He stood in it a while, then blew out the lamp and told himself that morning would know what to do. In the days that followed, talk in town thickened like summer flies. Kateri learned to hear her name in the length of a silence. Elias learned the difference between eyes that weighed and eyes that counted. The justice's clerk sent word that papers had been filed. The cousin was going to try every handle on the same locked door. Elias and Kateri rode in with their folder wrapped in leather that had known better years, and the clerk, who had never mended a fence in his life but had repaired more broken signatures than most, stamped copies and slid them back with a nod that said he had seen worse men than their cousin lose a neat case to an untidy truth. On the way out, a boy too young for whiskers spit near Jericho's boot and said, "Ain't proper." Elias looked down at the spittle drying in the dust like a little failed river, then back at the boy's face. "Proper is a word men use when they want what ain't theirs," he said mildly. "You'll find that out when you start wanting things." Kateri didn't smile until they were past the livery. When she did, it showed only in the softening at the corners of her eyes. "You sounded like John," she said. "I ain't him." "No," she agreed, "but the fence line holds either way." They got a second letter, thicker, self-important, written in the sort of script that hopes to make a fact by looping it twice. It named their marriage sudden, and their accounts suspect, and their brand questionable. Kateri read it at the table, and then set it down like you set down a pan too hot to hold and too useful to throw away. She did not curse. She was not raised to give anger the air it wants. "We answer it," she said. "We already are," he said, and tapped the ledger open to the place where John had written tidily, "Ask Elias." That night a storm got itself tangled up on the ridge and tried its best. Wind came first, insistent, young, all elbows and no manners. Then rain shouldered in, big drops that smacked the yard like flat stones. The roof remembered a place it had meant to leak, and did so with enthusiasm. Elias climbed the ladder with a handful of shingles and a mouth full of roofing nails, and Kateri held the lantern again, and neither of them said out loud the thing the light made plain, that this is what marriage looked like when it was not a dress and a cake, but two people in their stockings on a roof at midnight pinning a house to its bones. After, when the leak gave up, they sat on the top step with the lantern between them, watching rain silver itself under the porch eave. Kateri spoke without looking over. "When John was sick the first time," she said, "he counted calves with a fever and still got the number right. After he slept, he wrote the count in the ledger and added, 'Tied to the truth even when it pulls.'" She swallowed. "I didn't think I'd hear that rope again." Jericho turned the lamp wick down a hair. "Truth don't leave, even when men do." She let that sit. "You ever think on leaving?" "Most days before the letter," he said, "some after." And now, he was quiet long enough to be sure. "There's work unfinished." The next morning, sun lashed the puddles into steam. The world smelled like iron and dust confessing. Kateri brought out the good curtain and stitched the tier neat as if a judge could see it and might take it as evidence. Elias rode the north fence and lifted two fallen posts with a grunt that owned the sound. At noon, she set bread and cheese and pickle slices on a plate and carried it outside. He washed his hands at the pump and came to the table with that particular care of men who know how much can be knocked over by hurry. They ate like people who had learned how to be hungry without making a show of it. After the hearing, she said, "I'll take John's coat down." He looked at the porch post, where his hat sat with modesty. "You can put it up again if you need to." "I know," she said. Toward evening, a rider came hard, John's older cousin, face puckered like a seam ripped too many times. He drew rein with a jerk, meant to show horses who paid for their hay. A man in a narrow tie and a narrow sole slid down after him and cleared his throat, as if the land needed warning he was about to speak. "You'll find it's not that simple," the man said, tapping his case. The court has questions. Kateri did not step back. Good, she said. We have answers. Oh. The cousin's mouth twitched. You got a lot of nerve, girl. Kateri didn't move. I got a lot of work, she said. Nerve I use when strangers wander into my yard. Elias did not come closer. He rested his forearms on the top rail and looked at the men as if they were weather he'd ride through by and by. The cousin's eyes slid toward him, then away. This ain't over, he muttered. No, Elias agreed. It's not. He pointed his chin toward the lane. But your part is. Oh. They left with their dignity rattling in their stirrups like a loose cinch. Kateri let her breath go when their dust turned to blue distance. She looked at Elias. Thank you, she said. I was leaning, he answered. Sometimes that's all a man has to do. That night, with the yard rinsed clean, and the moon caught up on its own business, Kateri took John's coat from the peg. She held it to her face, breathed once, folded it careful, and set it on the bed chest. The room changed shape by a hair's breadth. She stood in the doorway a while, and then crossed the threshold into the spare room where Elias had already made the bed without being asked. She didn't touch anything. She only looked, took in the tidy boots, the coiled belt, the shirt folded with a soldier's habit and a cowboy's care. Then she nodded to no one and went back to the kitchen and set 2 cups on the table, and when he came in he did not reach for the old cup, but took the one she'd set for him. Sleep came easier that night. Not soft, nothing about this was soft but honest, like a day's work finished. Beyond the window, coyotes argued philosophy with the sort of certainty only coyotes and preachers enjoy. Somewhere, a windmill ticked. The land, which keeps its own counsel, rolled its shoulder and settled. And in the morning there was still that letter on the desk, and the month was still shorter than it ought to be. But the house did not look smaller under the truth. It looked like itself, which is not a small thing when paper wind starts up. Elias took his hat from the porch post and set it on his head without apology. Kateri ran her palm across the table once, as if testing grain. They did not say we. They didn't need to. The word was already working. The next week unrolled like a length of barbed wire, useful if handled right, merciless if handled wrong. Kateri kept to her ledger, her pencil marching through debts paid and oats tallied as if the neat columns could stiff-arm chaos. Jericho worked the fences until his palms opened in new blisters over the old scars, then went back out the next morning anyway. Every nail driven, every post stood upright, was another quiet vow. But both knew the day was coming when nails and vows would not be enough. The summons arrived folded into a square, stiff as tin. The courier who brought it avoided her eyes, dropped it like something hot onto the porch rail, and left before a thank you could catch him. Kateri slit it open with the paring knife she used for apples. The words inside were polite in the way a knife is polite when it waits on a table waiting to cut. A hearing set at the county seat. Date, hour, docket number. The cousin's accusations dressed up to look like law. Brand in dispute, debts in question, marriage unfit. She carried the letter outside. Jericho was setting a fresh shoe on a gelding, sweat streaking the dust on his neck. He saw the paper before he saw her face. They've said it, she said, her tone flat as the board across a corral gate. He tightened the clinch nail with a rasp, sparks flaring, then straightened. Good. Better to face them than let them circle. And, oh, the word steadied her, though her stomach still nodded. We'll need more than the ledger. We've got more, he answered, jerking his chin toward the house. Receipts, notes, brand renewals. John wrote everything down. We'll let the dead man speak. The days leading to the hearing were worked double chores in the morning, paper in the afternoons, sleep short at night. Kateri spread John's life across the table. Ledgers with margins darkened by his hand, receipts that smelled faintly of lamp smoke, folded letters where he had refused to sell even when it would have eased him. Jericho read aloud dates and tallies, his deep voice giving each figure the weight of testimony. Once, near midnight, Kateri looked up from the pile and caught him watching her. He wasn't staring at her face. He was looking at the way her hands moved across the paper, quick but careful, like she was sewing pieces of him back together. She did not comment, Neither did he. The silence had begun to change shape between them. It was no longer emptiness. It was space that held. The morning of the hearing dawned hot and sharp. Dust already curled off the road when they hitched the wagon. Kateri wore a black dress with the starch worn thin from washings, her collar white and clean. Jericho wore the white shirt again, sleeves rolled to his elbows, cuffs brushed though not new. They rode in with papers bundled tight in the leather folder. At the square, people had gathered more than belonged to the case. Farmers, townsfolk, a few idlers, leaning against posts for sport. John's cousin stood near the steps, his suit pressed so hard the seams threatened to give, his mouth pursed like he was already sucking the marrow of victory. Beside him loomed the hired agent, a man pale from desks and ink bottles, his leather case fat with documents. Kateri felt their eyes track her as she stepped down. Jericho's shadow fell across her shoulder. He didn't touch her, didn't need to. His nearness was as steady as a fence line. Inside, the courthouse smelled of dust and ink, its windows tall and merciless in the light they let in. The justice presiding was no young man eager to prove himself. She was a woman gray at the temples, her hair braided and tied close, her gaze sharp enough to peel excuses before they were spoken. She called the room to order with a gavel tap so light it sounded like a pebble against stone, yet the whispers hushed at once. The cousin's agent spoke first, words polished by rehearsal. He presented a paper that claimed the brand was lapsed, holding it high for all to see, though no county seal shone on it. He produced a list of debts long, alarming though half were guesses scrawled by merchants who had never trusted women with accounts. Finally, he leaned into the point sharpened best. The marriage, he said, was too sudden, too convenient. A union meant to shield property rather than honor love. His voice dripped disdain, as if saying widow was enough to prove his case. Kateri's hands curled in her lap until her knuckles paled. She could feel the crowd's eyes like burrs against her skin. Jericho sat beside her, silent, but the set of his jaw was answer enough. When the justice turned her gaze to the defense, Elias rose. He opened the leather folder, laying down the pages one by one, with the patience of a man stacking firewood. Receipts stamped with the county seal, a banknote marked paid in full, the letter where John had refused to sell a share. Proof, Jericho said, his voice plain, each word falling like a hammer strike. Not talk, not gossip, proof. Thou. The justice studied the papers long enough that the room's air grew taut. She asked questions, dates, numbers, calf counts, and Jericho answered without hurry, his memory steady as fence wire pulled tight. But Kateri knew silence could look like shame if it lasted too long. She stood, her heart pounding so hard she feared the crowd would hear it. She faced not the cousin but the justice. "My marriage is called sudden," she said. Her voice carried steady, though her throat burned. "It was sudden, yes. Sudden because men told me plain. Without it, the ranch would be carved by signatures. I chose Elias Jericho because he worked this land with John. He knows it as I do. No cousin in this room fed the herd through the fever. No agent here mended fences in the spring floods. That was us, him and me. If that is sudden, then sudden is honest." A murmur stirred the benches. The cousin shifted, his mouth tight. The agent cleared his throat, shuffled papers already weakened by truth. The justice leaned forward, her gaze steady on Kateri. "You claim knowledge of the herd?" "I do," Kateri said. And she began listing. The calves born last March, the steer sold in autumn, the salt blocks hauled from town, the flood that nearly tore the ditch. Each detail landed with the weight of memory lived, not rehearsed. Jericho added where needed, his deep voice folding into hers like two planks nailed to one frame. By the time the agent tried to speak again, his voice had lost its polish. His arguments looked thin against the leather folder fat with John's hand. The justice raised a palm. "I have what I need. My ruling in 2 days." Her gavel touched wood once. The case was done for now. When they left, the cousin turned his face away, red blotches burning at his collar. Outside, the crowd broke into whispers, but Kateri kept her chin high. She had stood, she had spoken, and the ground beneath her boots felt firmer than it had in months. The wagon ride home was quiet, but not the silence of distance. It was the silence of two people carrying weight together. She looked once at Jericho's hands on the reins, steady, scarred, and knew the truth plain. Whatever lay ahead, she would not face it alone. That evening, the sun bled across the ridge in colors fierce as fire. Kateri took John's coat from its peg by the door. For weeks it had hung there like a ghost. She folded it, slow and careful, and laid it in the trunk. When she looked up, Jericho stood in the doorway, hat in hand, eyes searching hers. She nodded once. "It doesn't belong by the door anymore." He said nothing. He didn't need to. The days that followed stretched tight, waiting for the ruling. But in those days, something shifted. Kateri placed 2 cups on the table each night and filled both without hesitation. Jericho began leaving his hat not on the porch post, but on John's peg inside. They spoke of the ranch not in fragments, but in plans: what field to plant, which heifers to keep, when to send for salt before the price rose. Small things, ordinary, yet together they formed a language sturdier than paper. The town still whispered. Some called her desperate, some called him opportunist, but when they rode in for supplies together, side by side, those whispers thinned. People had eyes. They could see the ranch still stood, the herd still grazed, and the widow was no longer cornered. 2 days later, the justice's ruling arrived in her own hand. The cousins' claims dismissed, the debts cleared, the brand renewal affirmed, the marriage recognized, the ranch secured under Kateri's control, with Elias Jericho named lawful husband and partner. On the courthouse steps, as the clerk read it aloud, Kateri felt her chest loosen for the first time since the funeral. Jericho stood steady beside her, not smiling, not boasting, but his presence was its own declaration. The cousin turned away, his face twisted. The agent gathered papers like a gambler pulling in broken bets. The crowd murmured, but no one dared challenge. On the wagon home, Kateri held the folded ruling in her lap. She brushed her thumb along the edge, feeling its weight as if it were more than paper. It was a shield, a future. She looked at Jericho. He kept his eyes on the road, but there was something in the angle of his shoulders that told her he felt it too. Back at the ranch, she stepped down and looked across the fields, the fences, the house standing plain and square. For the first time, she saw it not as something threatened, but as something held. That night, when Jericho brought his belongings from the spare room, she did not stop him. He set them down quiet, folded, orderly. She closed the trunk on John's coat, and when she turned back, the house felt less haunted. Not free of grief. Grief never leaves, but balanced. They sat at supper, bread and beans between them, ledger open to new plans. The lamp burned low, casting the walls in gold. Outside, the windmill turned, steady, faithful. Kateri laid her pencil across the ledger and looked at him. "People will still talk," she said. "Let them," he answered. "They weren't here. They didn't hold the line." She nodded. "We did." And in that quiet, in that truth, something rooted. Not passion yet, not the wildfire of love, but a seed, steady, stubborn, waiting for rain. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. Peace in Red Creek lasted about as long as the dew on a fence rail gone by the time the sun climbed high enough to burn the morning clean. The ruling from the justice still lay folded in the ledger drawer, safe as law could make it. Yet Kateri and Jericho both knew paper wasn't stronger than thirst or envy. Out here, survival was never written in ink. It was hammered into post holes, watered by springs, sweated into soil. The first warning came in silence. No birdsong, no frog at the ditch, no soft gurgle of the pump. Jericho tested it at dawn, working the handle until his arms shook, but all that came was a thin spit of rust-red water, not enough to fill a cup. The trough behind him lay cracked and empty, the cattle bawling against the rails with tongues swollen. He cursed low, the kind of word you don't waste unless something's truly wrong. When Kateri stepped from the house, hair still damp from the basin, she saw the look on his face and knew before he spoke. "She's gone dry," he said. She clutched the ledger tighter against her chest. The North Spring? He nodded grim. I'll ride out. Jericho saddled John's old bay, the horse stamping as though it knew thirst too, and set off at a steady lope toward the canyon where the spring had run steady through droughts worse than this. Kateri watched until the ridge swallowed him, the dust from his trail hanging in the air like a question without an answer. Alone, she walked to the corral. The herd pressed the rails, eyes rolling, sides heaving. Their suffering pressed into her bones harder than any whisper in town ever had. If water failed, the ranch failed. And if the ranch failed, everything she and John had poured into the soil would vanish like dew. Jericho came back hours later with mud on his boots, but no relief in his eyes. He dropped from the saddle, walked stiff to the porch, and spat into the dirt. Blocked, he said. Springs choked with rock and roots. We'll have to dig her out. Kateri leaned on the rail, her fingers biting the wood. Then we dig. That night they sat across from each other at the table. Supper cooled untouched. The only sound was the scrape of Jericho's whetstone against his hunting knife, each stroke sharp enough to cut silence. Kateri kept her hand on the ledger but didn't open it. Numbers meant nothing without water. At last she pushed it aside. Tomorrow. Both of us. He looked up, frown creasing. It's heavy work. So is keeping a house when the well runs dust, she shot back. Her eyes didn't waver. After a long breath, he nodded. The sun hadn't cleared the ridge when they rode out next morning. They carried shovels, a crowbar, and stubbornness born of desperation. The canyon walls funneled heat down onto them until sweat ran in rivers. Jericho swung the pick into the hard clay, each strike ringing against stone. Kateri crouched with the crowbar, prying roots that had knotted over the channel. Her gloves tore, blisters rising angry and raw, but she didn't quit. Once, Jericho caught sight of blood blooming on her palm. He opened his mouth to tell her to stop, then shut it again. He knew better. Telling her to rest would only waste breath neither of them had to spare. So he swung harder, as though to shoulder the hurt himself. Hours dragged, dust clung to their teeth, their throats rasped. At last the earth gave a grudging cough, and a thin trickle of water bled through. They both dropped to their knees, drinking handfuls muddy and sharp. The taste was iron and salvation. Jericho leaned back, chest heaving. It'll hold for now. Kateri wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist. Her eyes, exhausted and bright, met his. For now is all we ever get, she whispered. They filled barrels, sloshing heavy in the wagon, and drove home with the sun bleeding down behind them. The cattle smelled water before they saw it, crowding the fence until rails bent. Jericho hauled bucket after bucket, his shoulders shaking but steady, while Kateri steadied the trough boards. The herd plunged their muzzles deep, the sound of drinking loud as thunder. Kateri felt something in her chest loosen, not gone, but looser. That night, for the first time since John's burial, she opened the trunk and laid his coat inside for good. It had hung long enough, ghosting every doorway. She pressed her palm against the worn fabric once, then closed the lid. When she turned, Jericho was at the table with the ledger open, pencil in hand. He looked up, a question in his eyes. She slid into the chair opposite, wordless, and together they tallied head counts, until the lamp guttered low. But trouble doesn't die. It changes shape. 2 days later, word came from a rider passing through. Strangers had been spotted near the north fence, surveying posts with the calm of men measuring what isn't theirs. Jericho saddled before dawn, rifle strapped across his saddle. Kateri stood with her shawl wrapped tight. "You're not going alone," she said. He hesitated. "Could be danger." Her chin lifted. "Then it's ours to face, not yours." They rode side by side to the far pasture. Sure enough, the cedar post John had planted 3 summers past bore fresh axe scars. Jericho swung down, running calloused fingers over the wound as though it were flesh. His jaw tightened. "They're testing." Paper didn't scare them. Kateri's hand closed around the knife at her belt. "Then we'll make the line plain." "Oh." They spent the day remarking every boundary stones, stacked neat, posts reset, wire stretched till it sang. Sweat stung their eyes, dust burned their throats, but by dusk the fence line gleamed with defiance. Above them, buzzards circled lazy and low, as patient as lawyers. Back in town, whispers gathered like flies. Some claimed John's cousin had hired drifters to frighten them out, men with matches quicker than conscience. Kateri heard it in the store when two women bent their heads together, voices sharp with pity that wasn't pity. She bought nails anyway, her stare steady, and walked out with her goods as if gossip were no heavier than a sack of flour. That night, over a supper of beans and cornbread, she told Jericho. He chewed slow, swallowed, and set down his fork. "We'll take watches. I'll sit the first half." She didn't argue. "And I the second." So the ranch learned the feel of two sets of eyes in the dark. Jericho sat on the porch with the Winchester laid across his knees, lantern turned low, while coyotes sang beyond the ridge. When midnight came, he shook her shoulder gently, and she rose, pulling her shawl tight. She sat in the same chair, knife hidden beneath the folds, and kept watch until the stars leaned west. Dawn came empty. But absence today could mean fire tomorrow, and both knew it. Work didn't ease. If anything, the tension made each task heavier. Jericho found himself scanning the ridge more often than the herd. Kateri closed John's ledger one evening, the pencil trembling in her hand. "We can't live as though every night's a war," she said. He rubbed the back of his neck, voice rough. "I don't know another way." Her gaze softened, though her words stayed plain. "Then maybe it's time we learn one." The sentence hung between them like a seed dropped in dry soil, small, fragile, but alive. Whether it grew depended on storms yet to come. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of labor and watchfulness. Jericho's boots carved deep ruts between barn and pasture, between fence line and pump. Kateri's hands bore new calluses from hauling buckets, her shoulders stiff from keeping ledgers by day and lantern vigil by night. They moved like two halves of the same worn coin, scarred, battered, but still whole when held together. Yet Red Creek never gave without asking something back. The summer heat pressed down harder each week, until grass crisped to tinder and dust rose with every hoofbeat. The cattle grew restless, eyes rolling at the smell of dry wind, their balls carrying like grief across the land. Even the hens laid fewer eggs, the shells pale and thin, as though the drought seeped into everything living. One evening Jericho stood at the pump, wiping sweat with his forearm, and muttered, "Another week like this, and we'll be counting bones instead of calves." Kateri came to stand beside him, shawl tight around her shoulders, though the air was hot. "Then we'll find water," she said, "or make do until rain." He looked at her, saw the resolve burning quiet and steady in her eyes, and nodded. "We'll hold." The cousin, though beaten in court, hadn't vanished into the hills. Pride cut deeper than drought. Rumor said he'd hired men from the saloon's darker corners, drifters with no kin, no ledger, only a thirst for coin. Folks whispered they'd been seen near the ridge at dusk, carrying kerosene tins and matches. The threat hung heavier than the heat. A ranch can stand drought, but no spread survives fire. Jericho began walking the perimeter at night, rifle slung loose across his chest. Kateri joined him more often than not, her knife hidden beneath her shawl. Together they circled the house, the barn, the corral guardians against a darkness that might come with flame. One night, as the wind moaned through the cottonwoods, Kateri stopped at the fence rail and said, "We cannot fight shadow every evening. If they mean to burn us out, they will. But if we keep waiting for it, we'll go mad before the match is ever struck." Jericho leaned on the post, the lantern light catching the planes of his face. "I know, but walking the line keeps me from thinking too hard. A man can face danger better than he can face helplessness." She studied him, saw the truth of it, and for the first time she reached out, laying her hand on his wrist. The gesture was brief, steady, but enough to make his chest tighten. "Then let's not call it waiting," she said. "Let's call it holding ground." The next day dawned thick with smoke haze, though no fire touched their land. Somewhere west a lightning strike had lit the grass. Ash floated like gray snow across the yard. Kateri stood on the porch, watching flakes fall into the water trough. "The land remembers," she whispered. Jericho carried buckets to the herd, his jaw set. "Then so will we." Days stretched long, nights longer. But even in strain, small moments surfaced. One noon, After mending wire under a merciless sun, Jericho found bread and cheese laid on the porch rail. Kateri didn't call him in. She simply left the plate. He sat, ate in silence, and when he returned the empty tin, she met his eyes for a heartbeat before looking away. That night, he set his hat not on the porch post but on the peg inside. She didn't move John's coat back out. Another evening, a storm teased the horizon, thunder grumbling, lightning dancing, but no rain reaching their thirsty fields. Jericho stood with his hands on the fence, watching the sky. "She's taunting us," he said. Kateri came to his side, her skirt brushing his boots. "The land owes us nothing," she replied. "All we can do is keep asking." The storm rolled past, leaving dust thicker than before. But in that shared moment beneath a sky that gave no mercy, something shifted. They weren't just fighting drought or cousins anymore. They were fighting despair, and they were fighting it together. The true test came a week later. Just after midnight, Jericho woke to the smell of kerosene. He rolled from the cot, rifle in hand, and found Kateri already in the doorway, knife drawn, eyes sharp in the lamplight. "Barn," she whispered. They burst outside to see flame-licking straw piled near the corner, a small fire catching hungry. Jericho smothered it with wet burlap sacks, while Kateri hauled water from the trough, flinging it onto the boards until the smoke choked them both. The fire died gasping, leaving only black scars on the wood. Jericho spat into the dirt, coughing. "Drifters." Kateri's chest heaved, her face streaked with soot. "They'll come back." He looked at her, rifle heavy in his hands, and answered plain, "Then so will we." For the next nights, they kept watch in shifts, lanterns turned low, rifles ready. But no more flames came. Perhaps the drifters lost their nerve, or perhaps the cousin's purse ran dry. Either way, the danger hadn't vanished, it had only retreated. The strain left its mark. Jericho's eyes grew darker, the lines on his face deeper. Kateri's hair streaked with silver that hadn't been there the spring before. Yet in their exhaustion, something new lived. Trust. Not spoken, but practiced. She poured his coffee without asking if he wanted it. He mended the hinge on her pantry door without being told. These were not grand gestures, but they were vows all the same. One Sunday, they rode into town together. Heads turned, whispers buzzed, but no one spoke aloud. At the church door, the preacher clasped their hands and said only, "God give you rain." Kateri's throat tightened, but she nodded, and Jericho squeezed her hand once before letting go. That evening, back at the ranch, the sky finally broke. Rain fell hard, drumming the tin roof, filling the barrels, sweetening the air. They stood on the porch together, letting the cool spray touch their faces. Kateri laughed once short, surprised, almost foreign after so many months. Jericho turned toward her, the corners of his mouth lifting in something near a smile. "Looks like the land answered after all," he said. She shook her head, eyes bright. "Not the land, just mercy, for once." The herd bellowed in relief as water filled the troughs. The earth drank deep. For a night, Red Creek smelled like life instead of dust. Later, when the rain slowed, they sat at the table with the ledger open. Kateri traced John's handwriting, steady and plain, and whispered. He would have been proud. Jericho met her gaze. He'd have been stubborn. Pride was always yours. She closed the book gently. "Maybe now it's ours." The words lingered. Not a declaration of love, not yet, but an admission that what began as necessity had grown roots. Roots deeper than drought, deeper than paper. Roots planted in the daily act of standing together against a world eager to take. As night fell and the last drops tapped the eaves, Jericho sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, out of habit more than fear. Kateri came to stand beside him, shawl wrapped close. She looked out at the soaked yard, the fences glistening, the cattle lying content at last. "Tomorrow will be harder," she said softly. He nodded, eyes on the horizon where clouds still smoldered. "It always is." But for the first time in months, the air carried the scent of wet earth instead of dust, and in that scent was promise. "Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, Do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you." The courthouse hearing was set for a Tuesday morning, and by the time Kateri and Jericho arrived, the square outside was already crowded. Farmers, townsfolk, and John's cousin with his hired agent all lingered near the steps. The cousin stood stiff, his suit pressed sharper than the occasion required, his eyes moving over Kateri with a mixture of smugness and disapproval. The agent beside him carried a leather case stuffed with papers, his face pale but confident. Kateri felt their stares before she reached the door, but she kept her chin high. Jericho walked one step behind, his silence firm, his presence a shield she could lean on without ever asking aloud. Inside, the hearing room smelled of ink and old plaster. Whitewashed walls reflected the morning sun through tall windows that let the heat creep in. The justice, a woman with silver hair tied into a tight knot, sat at the front behind a desk stacked with ledgers and a small gavel. Her eyes were sharp, the kind that stripped pretense from words before they reach her ears. She called the room to order without raising her voice, and the whispers from the benches fell quiet. The agent rose first, his voice smooth, rehearsed. He claimed John's brand had not been renewed properly, presenting papers that looked neat, but bore no county seal. He argued that debts tied to tools and equipment remained unsettled, waving a list that he suggested was incomplete. Finally, he leaned into his strongest point, that the marriage had taken place suspiciously soon after John's death, implying that Kateri had rushed to secure the estate. Each argument was delivered with practiced ease, his tone dripping with polite disdain. Kateri's pulse beat hard in her throat as the justice turned her gaze to the defense. Jericho stepped forward first, setting the leather folder on the table. He opened it carefully, laying down receipts one by one. Brand renewal signed by John Carver. Clerk stamped 3 months before his passing. He spoke plain, slow, his finger resting on the seal for the justice to see. He placed a banknote next. Debt cleared, paid in full. Then the folded letter John had written years before. His words, refusing a loan and stating clear the ranch would not be divided. The justice studied each page, nodding slightly. Still, the air in the room felt tight, as though the crowd expected more. Kateri could feel every pair of eyes on her. Her palms dampened, but she forced herself to stand. For days she had let Jericho carry the voice of defense, but now she realized silence would only strengthen the accusations against her. "My marriage is questioned because of timing," Kateri said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. She kept her eyes on the justice, not the cousin. "The truth is this. I was pressed by the town's own elders. They told me if I did not remarry, John's work would be stolen by false claims. I chose Jericho because he worked this land with John, because he knows it as I do. No one else here fed the herd, mended these fences, or counted every calf born last spring. No one but us." Her words carried across the room, sharper for their plainness. She felt the sting of pride and grief mixing in her throat, but she did not falter. The cousin shifted in his chair, his face tightening, the agent frowning, as if his lines had slipped out of place. The justice asked questions, direct and unbending: dates of fence repair, head count of the herd, deliveries of feed and salt blocks. Jericho answered each one with precise detail, his memory steady, his voice level. Kateri added where needed, describing the spring flood that nearly cut the ditch, the fever that had slowed John but not broken the work, the way the herd had been sold last season at a fair count. Each detail stacked upon the last, until the justice had more truth than accusation. By the time the cousin's agent tried to speak again, his voice had lost its edge. His papers looked thin against the thick folder Kateri and Jericho had laid out. The justice leaned back, her eyes narrowing on the cousin. "You'll have my ruling in 2 days," she said firmly. Her gavel touched wood once, sharp but calm, and the hearing was dismissed. Kateri exhaled slowly as they left the room, her legs heavy but her spine straight. Jericho walked beside her, his face unreadable but his steps steady. Outside, the cousin avoided her gaze, turning his back toward the street. The crowd broke into low murmurs, but Kateri paid them no mind. She had spoken, she had stood. And for the first time since John's death, she felt she had defended not only his name, but her own place in the life he had left behind. On the wagon ride home, she looked at Jericho. "I never wanted this," she said quietly, "but I will not let them take what was ours." Jericho kept his eyes on the road. "They won't," he answered. His tone carried no boast, only certainty born of years beside John. Kateri nodded once, and in that silence between them, trust took root, small but real. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. The justice's words still echoed in Kateri's head as the wagon rattled back over the dirt road toward the ranch. 2 days. It was both a promise and a wait. 2 days before, they would know if the ranch was secured or lost. The ride home was quiet, the sun leaning west, dust rising behind the wheels. Kateri's hands tightened on her lap more than once, though she kept her face composed. Jericho guided the reins with calm control, his expression unreadable, but his mind moved restlessly through every detail he had spoken before the justice. He replayed his answers, searching for cracks, though he knew there had been none. When they returned, the ranch felt the same at first glance. The fences, the herd grazing in the lower pasture, the hens scratching by the coop, but Kateri noticed something different in how she looked at it now. Every corner seemed fragile, as if it might be stripped away if the ruling fell against them. The sight made her chest tighten, but it also sharpened her resolve. She would not let strangers put their hands on John's life's work. That evening, Kateri folded John's coat from its peg by the door. She had avoided touching it for weeks, leaving it as a relic, a sign that he might still walk back through the doorway. But now, with the hearing behind them and the judgment ahead, she knew she could not keep living in pause. She folded the coat carefully and carried it into the bedroom, placing it in the trunk by the bed. Jericho saw her as he came in from the yard, his hands still dusty from fixing a rail. He stopped in the doorway, unsure if he should speak. Kateri looked up. "It doesn't belong by the door anymore," she said simply. Her voice was steady, though her throat felt tight. Jericho nodded once, not asking more. But inside, he felt a shift. Small, almost unnoticeable, yet real. She was beginning to move forward, even if it hurt. That night, Kateri stood in the spare room doorway while Jericho set his boots neatly by the bed. "You can move your things when you're ready," she said. The words surprised even her as they left her lips. Jericho paused, his back straightening. "I will not step ahead of you," he answered, his voice firm but careful. Kateri shook her head. "You're not ahead. You're here. That's all." She left the doorway, leaving the words to settle in him as heavily as they had in her. The following day, Kateri brought the ledger to the kitchen table. She opened it between them, her finger tracing John's handwriting. Together, they reviewed the numbers. Herd counts, debts paid, supplies ordered. Jericho leaned closer, pointing at the lines where expenses could ease. After the next herd sale, Kateri added her thoughts about planting, about which calves to keep, her voice even and steady. It was the first time they had spoken to the ranch, not in fragments, not in defense, but in planning. Later, as dusk fell, they sat on the porch. The air was warm, the sky a pale red, the corral fence dark against the horizon. Kateri rested her hands in her lap, watching the herd settle. "People will still talk," she said softly. "They'll say it was too quick, that I married for safety." Jericho sat beside her, elbows on his knees, eyes on the yard. "Let them," he said. "They weren't here when John worked this land. They don't know what it costs to keep it." His tone carried no anger, only certainty. Kateri felt a faint calm settle inside her chest at his words. That night, as she blew out the lamp, Kateri realized something she had not admitted even to herself. She no longer feared being left alone to fight. Whether the justice ruled for them or against them, she knew Jericho would stand with her. It did not erase her grief, nor did it soften the whispers in town, but it eased the sharp edge of loneliness. And for the first time since John's death, she slept without waking in the dark to listen for footsteps that would never return. The ranch lay still under the stars, waiting. 2 days hung between them and their future, but for once, Kateri felt she could bear the weight, not because she was strong enough alone, but because she was no longer carrying it alone at all. 2 days later, the ruling came written in the justice's own hand, carried by the same clerk who had guided them through the county ledgers. Kateri and Jericho stood side by side on the courthouse steps as the clerk unfolded the paper and read it aloud. The words were firm and exact. The cousins' claims dismissed as unproven, the brand renewal affirmed, the water rights secured, the debts cleared, and the estate recognized under Kateri's control with Jericho named as her lawful husband and partner. No loophole, no uncertainty. The law was finally on their side. The cousin's face burned red as he turned away, his agent gathering the failed papers with hurried hands. The crowd outside shifted, murmurs rising, but no one dared challenge the justice's decision. Kateri stood straight, her jaw set, though her chest ached with the weight finally lifting. She had not realized until that moment how much fear she had carried in silence. Fear that John's life's work would be stripped from her piece by piece. Now it was safe. She was safe. Jericho glanced at her, his expression steady, but inside he felt something break free. For months, guilt had pressed on him, the thought that he could never repay John. Now standing with Kateri, he felt that maybe repayment wasn't the point. John had trusted him to stay, and he had. That was enough. The ride home was quiet, but not strained. Kateri held the folded ruling in her lap, her thumb brushing the edge of the paper, as if to reassure herself it was real. Jericho kept his eyes on the road, guiding the team with calm precision. When they reached the yard, Kateri stepped down first and looked at the ranch spread before her. The fences, the corral, the house standing firm. For the first time since John's death, she saw it not as a burden waiting to be taken, but as a home secured. That evening, after the chores were done, Kateri opened the trunk by the bed and placed John's folded coat inside for good. She smoothed it once with her hand, then closed the lid. When she turned, Jericho stood in the doorway, his belongings stacked neatly in his arms. He didn't speak, but his eyes asked the question. Kateri gave a small nod. "Bring them here," she said. Her voice was calm, not forced, not hesitant. He stepped inside and set his things down. No ceremony, no hesitation. It was not passion that moved between them, but a quiet acceptance, the kind built on days of standing shoulder to shoulder. They ate supper at the table together, not hurried, not strained. Kateri spoke of the garden rows that would need tending now that the season was warming, of which heifers to hold back for breeding. Jericho added his thoughts about the fences on the north line, about trading for salt blocks before the price rose again. It was the language of work, plain and steady, but behind it lay something deeper. 2 lives settling into a rhythm that belonged to both of them. In the weeks that followed, the whispers in town softened and turned elsewhere. Neighbors saw Kateri and Jericho sit side by side at church, saw them ride together in a town for supplies, saw the ranch running with order and strength. There was no scandal left to cling to, only the plain fact that the Carver place stood whole, and the widow was no longer alone. By summer, the herd sold strong at market, the accounts balanced clean. Kateri stood on the porch one evening, the air warm, the corral fence glowing in the low Sunday. Jericho joined her, leaning on the rail beside her. For a while, neither spoke. Then Kateri broke the silence. "We didn't marry for love." Her voice carried no regret, only truth. Jericho looked at her, his face calm. "No." She turned her eyes to the field, watching the cattle move slow in the fading light. "But we stayed," she said. He nodded once. "We stayed." The words settled between them, not as a promise, but as a fact already lived. They didn't need more. That night, the house felt different. Not John's house held in waiting, not a place balanced between grief and fear. It was theirs, quiet, steady, whole. And as the windmill turned slow under the stars, the ranch stood firm, its future secured, not by chance or law alone, but by 2 people who had chosen day after day to remain. For Kateri, the fear of being cast adrift had ended. For Jericho, The years of drifting without a name to anchor him were over. What began as obligation had settled into belonging, and neither would ever be the same. The wind, a constant whisper in the Arizona desert, picked up a silent, ancient breath across the land. It carried with it the scent of wild sage and distant rain. Jericho, the man who had been a ghost, a drifter, a shadow haunted by a past he couldn't outrun, felt the familiar pull of the open road. But this time, it was different. It wasn't a desire to escape, but a deep, primal call to explore. He had a home now, a family, and a purpose. Yet, the horizon, a line blurred by heat and endless possibility, beckoned. Kateri, her hand resting lightly on his arm, watched him. She, too, had found an anchor, a quiet strength she had never known, but she also had the spirit of the Apache, a people who roamed, who honored the land by moving with it. The future stretched out before them, not as a ledger of debts and obligations, but as a map of infinite, unwritten trails. Maybe they wouldn't stay rooted here forever. Maybe they would venture out, find new lands, new challenges, and write their own cowboy love stories together. The air was filled with a sense of Wild West love, a love not of possession, but of shared freedom. It was a beautiful, chaotic, and utterly unpredictable Wild West love story. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments. Today's story is about pains that seemed to have no way out until a small ray of light changed everything. Do you believe that even in the darkest times, there's always a miracle waiting at the end of the road? And if deep down you still believe that God is watching over you, quietly arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment, AMEN, below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write it, a blessing may quietly find its way into your life. Su hijo le llevó una esclava apache. El hacendado cambió el destino con un simple se queda. The old rancher, a man worn down by a life carved out of hard rock and unforgiving sun, sat on his porch. The late light ran thin across the scrub, a pale ribbon dragged over mesquite and broken fence posts. Wind lifted the dust in lazy spirals that rose, thought better of it, and fell again. Out here, even the wind learned humility. Before we get into the heart of this tale, do me a favor and hit that like button. And if you're not already, subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. It's a lonely life out here, and knowing you're out there makes it a little less so. Jack Hayes had lived alone for almost 7 years. The war had taken more than the hearing in his left ear. It had taken his wife, Sarah, and their newborn son, Billy Fever, in the winter, while Jack wore Union blue 100 leagues away, learning what gunpowder does to soft men and stubborn ideals. When he came back, there was only the house he and Sarah had raised from cottonwood and grit, a wind-bent strip of land no one wanted but him, and the kind of silence that presses into bone until a man cannot tell if the ache is from the weather or the memories. He kept the ranch running because motion was easier than grief. He fed cattle because animals ate without asking why. He mended wire because some things could still be fixed if you kept your hands moving. He spoke seldom, prayed less, and believed in exactly 2 truths. A man's word was iron, and the right thing seldom felt easy. That afternoon he sat with his boots hooked on the porch rail, hat tipped low, watching the yard the way a shepherd watches a hillside. He wasn't expecting company. Solitude had a schedule you could set your pulse by. So when he heard the horse before he saw it drumming hooves, breath hard and hot on the chill air, he lowered his boots and leaned forward. Years on this land had taught him to trust sound over sight. The rider broke over the rise in a loose spray of dust. Jed Murdoch, the neighbor kid who mistook recklessness for courage, spurs for manhood, speed for certainty. Jed rode, as if he were trying to outrun his own name. Jack pushed up, knees stiff, and stepped to the porch edge. Jed hauled his horse up short before the rail and jumped down before the mare had done stopping. A rope trailed from his hand. At the far end of it, as if she were a stray yearling and not a person at all, a young native woman stood barefoot in the dust. Her wrists were looped in the rope tight enough to raise angry welts. Hair like river shadow fell in mats down her back. The buckskin dress she wore had been torn at the shoulder, and along the hem, the raw edges chalked white with dust, and Sunday she did not hang her head. She did not beg. She stood as a tree stands after lightning blackened, smoldering, alive. "What is this supposed to mean?" Jack asked, and the old timbre of his voice left no room for boyish jokes. Jed grinned the way young men grin when they think they've done something clever. "A gift of gratitude, Hayes. Caught her nosing around my paddock, and the fellas in town said someone ought to make use of her. Figured you could. You've worked this place to the bone. Thought you deserved well." He made a loose, obscene gesture at the rope. "Payment." Jack looked at the rope, then at Jed, then back at the woman. His jaw worked once, twice. "She isn't a horse. Would you rather I'd left her free?" Jed shot back. "They'd have flogged her in town. Or worse." "Ugh." Jack lifted his eyes to the woman and found her looking straight back.